everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and this week's contract tip has to do with the binding agreement date. This concept is vital to our real estate contracts here in Georgia, as that all of the timing for all the other parts of the purchase and sale agreement are timed from this date, the binding agreement date. All the contingency timeframes and typically all the other time frames that a buyer and seller must adhere to start and end with, well, not end, but start or time from the binding agreement date. So it is very, very important that all parties understand what that date is and how it can be determined, and just all information about the binding agreement date. So in general, well, let me just read you what it says. In the Georgia, let me tell you in general. In general, what the binding agreement date is that is the time frame, that is the specific date when all parties are aware that they have a contract between them. So that is the date when the buyer and the seller know that there is a contract from which they have responsibilities and consequences and moving forward towards the purchase and sale of real property. So the that's the general concept of what it is. The definition, the general definition of what the binding agreement date is that is the date when all parties have, or that is the date of notice of acceptance. And basically the easiest way to remember it is the last party to make an offer is the party that binds the contract. So if you are going, buyer makes an offer to the seller. If the seller doesn't make any changes and signs it, that's accepted, but it is not binding upon the parties at that point. So in that example, a buyer makes an offer to the seller. The seller doesn't make any changes. They sign the offer. Again, those terms are still not binding upon the parties. Even though the seller has accepted those terms without any changes, the buyer has no knowledge that the seller has accepted those terms. So until the seller, in this specific example, gets the accepted contract back to the buyer, it is not binding. So again, the party that made the last offer, in this situation, the buyer, is the one that binds it. In a situation where you've got a buyer and a seller, and the buyer makes an offer, seller makes a counter offer, buyer makes an offer, seller makes a counter offer, the buyer signs it. Again, it is not binding when the buyer signs it. It is only binding when the buyer then gets it back to the seller and the seller binds it, because in that situation, the seller was the last party to make the offer or counter offer. So easiest way to think of it is the last party to make the last offer is the party that binds. So let me read you how it is defined in the contracts. So in the GAR contract, under other provisions, paragraph 4F, binding agreement date, it specifically states, the binding agreement date shall be the date when a party to this transaction who has accepted an offer or counteroffer to buy or sell real property delivers notice of that acceptance to the party who made the offer or counteroffer in accordance with the notices section of this agreement. Notice of the binding agreement date may be delivered by either party or by the broker working with or representing such party to the other party. If notice of accurate binding agreement date is delivered, the party receiving the notice shall sign the same and immediately return it to the other party. That's the definition in the GAR contract. In the RE forms contract, it's in the standard terms under miscellaneous, paragraph 12.9. Now, in the RE forms contract, they use the term accepted contract for this concept of binding agreement date. I personally wish they would have used a different term, because an accepted contract is different than those terms being binding upon the parties. But nevertheless, they use the term accepted. So in the RE forms contract, and again, this is in the standard terms, which is document RE1, paragraph 12.9.1, It is the same concept. The binding contract, when the terms are binding upon the parties, again, is notice of acceptance. So it says, an acceptance or accepted shall mean the acceptance of the contract pursuant to the right to do so provided in the contract. Acceptance shall occur only prior to the offer being withdrawn, revoked, or terminated in writing and in accordance with any provision of the contract. If the receiver of an offer accepts it exactly as presented without modification, provided acceptance is communicated in writing to the party making the offer. So again, it's notice of that acceptance. It's communication of that acceptance in writing by the party. So again, easiest way to remember for you guys, the party, regardless if it's the buyer or the seller, the party that makes the last offer or counter offer is the only party that binds the contract. So that's what a binding agreement date is. That is how the binding agreement date is established. Now, there's a whole lot more to it. It has to do with notice, and you'll notice, no pun intended, that in those definitions, both of those contracts define it as written notice, so it has to be in writing, number one, signed by the parties, and per the notice as provided in the contract. I've done several video contract tips on notice. Please review those. So it can't be by phone, it can't be email to email, agent to agent. It has to be signed by the buyer or the seller. And again, review those video tips on notice to understand what proper notice is for conveying a binding agreement date and notice of the binding agreement date. So that's one thing, is it has to be within the context of proper notice. The second thing is that it all has to do with the time limit of the offer or the counter offer as presented to the party. So in the purchase and sale agreements, and I've done another, I believe so, I'm pretty sure, I've done another video contract tip on time limits. And there are a lot of agents in our marketplace that mistakenly think the time limit on a purchase and sale agreement on an offer or a counter offer means that is the time frame within which the other party is to respond. That is not what a time limit is at all. A time limit is that these terms as presented in the offer or counter offer are open for acceptance until that time frame. So if an offer has a time limit on it of let's just say March 26th at 8 p.m. at night, and the party signs it. So that's, let's just say, for example, that's a buyer making an offer to a seller. They put a time limit of March 26th, 8 p.m. at night. If the seller does not make any changes and signs that offer they have to sign it and deliver notice back to the offerer prior to 8 p.m. that night. Then you will have a binding agreement. If in this example, buyer writes an offer, puts a time limit on it, March 26, 8 p.m. at night. If the seller signs it prior to 8 p.m. at night, but does not deliver notice back to the buyer, back to the last person making the offer, until after 8 p.m., you do not have a binding contract. It has to be notice of acceptance prior to the expiration of the time limit. So you would not have a binding contract in that situation. The notice has to be delivered prior to the expiration of that time limit. The other thing is, the other example in this situation, buyer writes an offer, puts a time limit on it, March 26th, 8 p.m. at night. If the buyer signs it after 8 p.m. and delivers it back immediately, same thing. You do not have a binding contract. So in that situation, if the party, and again, I'm just using buyer seller, but it could go the other direction if it's a counteroffer situation. But if the buyer writes an offer, time limit 8 p.m. March 26th. If the seller, regardless of what time they sign it, if they don't make any changes and they return that signed accepted contract back to the buyer after the time limit, it is not binding upon the parties. It constitutes a counteroffer. At that point in time, The buyer then either can accept it or reject it. If the buyer chooses to accept it, then the buyer then has to send notice of acceptance back to the seller, and the seller in that situation would bind it, because since it was not accepted within the time limit, it is a counteroffer, and you have to go one more round, and it would now constitute the seller making the offer. The other thing that agents get confused with the time limits is if the buyer, let's say the buyer writes an offer, same example, buyer writes an offer, puts a time limit on it of March 26th, 8 p.m. at night. If the seller writes a counteroffer, it doesn't matter if they get that counteroffer back to the buyer March 27th, March 28th, March 29th, or March 26th at 10 p.m., whatever. They are changing the terms. A time limit only has to do with the terms as presented in that offer or counteroffer without any change or modification. So if one party is making a counteroffer to the other party, then there would be a new time limit or no time limit on that counteroffer. But the original time limit on that first offer gets thrown out if there is a counteroffer, if those terms are modified or changed. So again, agents, if there is a time limit on an offer or counteroffer and the parties accept the terms, that notification of acceptance must be delivered back to the party making the last offer prior to the expiration of that time limit in order to have a binding contract. All right, that's one concept. Another concept is, well, that's the second concept. First concept was has to be done within the forms of notice as outlined in the purchase and sale agreements. Second one is if there is a time limit, the notice has to be delivered back prior to that time limit. The third, I think I've already addressed that a little bit, is if an acceptance was given after a time limit but without change, it does constitute a counteroffer, and the party can accept it or reject it at that point. Another concept is the party making the last offer, whether it be buyer or seller, if it's an offer or counteroffer, if the party that made the last offer withdraws their offer, again, in writing, signed by the party, with notice sent that they are withdrawing the offer, prior to notice of acceptance being pulled back, being given, then that offer is accepted. So in an example for that, let's say that I am a seller. So I received an offer from a buyer. I wrote a counter offer back to the buyer, and I put a time limit on it of April 24th at 4 p.m. Let's say the buyer signs it April 24th at 11 a.m., but the buyer has not yet delivered it back to the seller. So the terms have been accepted, but that contract is not binding upon the parties because the seller, the party that made the last counteroffer, has not received notice of acceptance. So the buyer has signed it, but they haven't given it back to the seller. Let's say as the seller, I get another offer that I want to accept. All I have to do is sign a written withdraw of my last offer or counteroffer to this buyer, because it's not binding upon me yet because I haven't received the signed contract. Then I am free to accept offer number 2 and sell to party number 2. So you buyers, well, all you agents, if you're a buyer's agent or a listing agent, when you have parties that sign a contract and accept the terms, it is incumbent upon you to immediately send that notice of acceptance back to the party making the last offer so the terms can be binding upon the parties. Now, another issue that happens is if you have a, let's say in a situation you have a buyer that writes an offer to the seller. The seller signs it within the time frame and sends it back within the time frame. So you will have a binding contract. But let's say that the parties go binding. Okay, so the buyer wrote an offer, the seller signed it. Let's say the seller signs it on a Friday night, gets it back to the the listing agent. If the listing agent, let's say the seller or the listing agent filled in the purchase and sale agreement, the binding agreement date is Friday night, but the listing agent, for whatever reason, does not get it back to the buyer until Saturday. Regardless of the time, regardless of the date that is actually filled out on the purchase and sale agreement, the binding agreement date is Saturday. It is not Friday. So if you are an agent and if you are the party to bind, so the last party making an offer, and you receive a purchase and sale agreement or counter offer back, and the binding agreement date is filled out and it is not the same day that you receive it, you need to get that squared away right away, because the problem is we are off by a day. And so you're going to have one party that thinks the end of due diligence, financing contingency, appraisal contingency ends on one day, when in actuality it would end on a day later. That's a very difficult conversation to have with your clients when you're at the end of a contingency time frame and both parties want that earnest money, then getting it squared away right up front. It doesn't matter what date is filled in on a purchase and sale agreement. The binding agreement date can be proven beyond the shadow of a doubt through the forms of notice. So when that email with the attachment of the accepted contract was sent back to the other party, that can be determined through the methods of communication, whether it be email, fax, or delivery, or the other methods of notification. But again, as an agent, you guys need to get all the parties on the same page of what the actual binding agreement date is if it is incorrect on the purchase and sale agreement in and of itself. Now, if you, in that same situation, let's say I'm the party making the last offer, let's say I'm the buyer, I send it to the seller signs it, the seller fills in the binding agreement date as today, and they send it back to me today. Technically, I should have been the party to fill in the binding agreement date, but if the day is the same day, it doesn't matter. What's important, what all the time frames in the purchase and sale agreement are timed from, is the actual date. So again, it doesn't matter which agent actually completes that on the contract as long as the date is correct. And then one last thing, and I believe I have already covered this in another video contract tip as well, but timing. How do you count the timing? So again, we mentioned that all of the contingency time frames are timed from the binding agreement date. That's why it is vitally important. That date is day 0 when you are counting. So let's say, for example, a buyer and a seller have negotiated an 8-day due diligence time frame from the binding agreement date. The date the parties go binding is day 0, regardless of the time of the day. That is day 0. So day 1 starts tomorrow. So for example, today is April 24th. If we go binding today and the buyer and seller agreed to an 8-day due diligence period, the 24th is day 0, 25th is day 1, 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th, 30th, September, May 1st, May 2nd. So 11:59 p.m. at night on May 2nd would be the 8-day due diligence period, because the date the parties actually go binding, again, starts at 0 for counting purposes. Now, one other, a little bit confusing issue with binding agreement date is in a backup, if a contract is a backup contract and the parties have the backup contingency exhibit that they have signed. And again, I've addressed this also in another contract. I've done a lot of video contract tips. In that situation, the parties, the buyer and the seller, actually go binding. The binding agreement date is the date that the buyer and the seller go binding with a backup contingency exhibit in place and signed and part of the all of the documents in the contract. So that's the binding agreement date for the backup contract. However, for timing purposes, for all the contingencies that the buyer and the seller agreed to, that date would be the date that the seller gives buyer number 2, backup buyer, written notice that they are now the primary contract. That date becomes the effective binding agreement date for all the contingency timeframes in a backup contract. So you're going to have a true binding agreement date when the buyer and the seller went binding with that backup contingency exhibit. But for timing purposes, it's the date the buyer gets written notice from the seller that they are now in the primary position. I did cover that in the binding agreement backup exhibit. So a lot about binding agreement date, and it is very, very important. I hope this contract tip helped you out. Thank you so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.